Hey everybody, I'm Tim Mooney. If you're a student of speech, rhetoric, political science, philosophy, psychology, or the theater, or if you just want to understand any of those a little better, you'll want to stick around to hear I Finally Get Socrates' Apology, Part 2. Today I'm working my play, The Greatest Speech of All Time, back up into performance shape, and that gives me a chance to think about the many issues that weave their way through these speeches. I'll be performing this show this Sunday and Monday, February 14th and 15th, 2021 at 8 p.m. Central Time on Facebook and Zoom. And it's available for bookings either by broadcast or live and in person, once live and in person is safe. Today, I'm taking a second deep dive into the character of Socrates and his great speech, the Apologia. The Apology. The speech itself is perhaps an hour long, but I only performed the last 15% or so as part of the greatest speech of all time. A couple of weeks back, I doubled back to the very beginning of the speech to take a closer look at the first 20% of it. You can check out that video here. In this video, I'm only going to explore the second 20% or so. It's a somewhat arbitrary division, mostly based on what I can delve into for 15 minutes or less. But certain themes do seem to recur through this section. Either way, you probably want to hit subscribe or ring the bell so that you don't miss out on our upcoming episodes as we continue our way through it. And if you want to catch the climax of Socrates' Apology, you can see that when I perform the show on Sunday and Monday. So, here we go with I Finally Get Socrates' Apology, Part 2. So you may recall that Socrates spent the early part of the speech dealing with the reputation he had been given from Aristophanes, who wrote Socrates into his satiric comedy, The Clouds, some 24 years earlier. And he spent much of his early refutation first countering the ready-made opinion that theater attendants and subsequent retold jokes and rumors had already planted firmly into the minds of the many, many judges, perhaps about 500 of them, who are to determine whether or not they will ultimately sentence Socrates to death. As we take up this second section of the speech, Socrates notes that he has three accusers, Melatus, Anytus, and Lycon, who represent, respectively, the poets, the artisans, and the politicians. Since Socrates is next going to turn to Melatus and then Anytus, we may assume that the previous part of the speech addressed the accusations of Lycon, who was representing the politicians, sometimes called rhetoricians, during which Socrates explained that he, like they, understood nothing, but that at least he knew that he knew nothing. Much as with the politicians, so also Socrates tells of his continued inquiries among the poets and artisans in his quest to understand why the oracle at Delphi should have declared that he, Socrates, himself is the wisest of men. And while the poets may have written brilliant or inspired poetry, what Socrates discovered was that they could not explain their poetry any better than the most ignorant around him, which led him to conclude that their brilliant poetry was the product of genius or inspiration and not of wisdom. The word genius comes from the same root as genie, and it sometimes helps to think of a genius not as someone exceedingly smart or wise, but who has a genie, essentially sitting on their shoulder, whispering inspiration into their ear. Likewise, Socrates went to the artisans, or the craftsmen, and discovered that in the fulfillment of their craft, these men did indeed know many fine things, but that they, like the poets, fell into the mistaken assumption that because they knew much about, say, construction or horsemanship, they also knew all sorts of high matters, and concluded that this defect in them overshadowed their wisdom, leaving Socrates to conclude that he himself was better off not having the knowledge of the artisans, if only to avoid the ignorance that accompanies it. Now, it turns out that people tend not to like having somebody out there informing them, and anyone else who happens to be listening in, that they know little or nothing, whether or not that person thinks he is doing them a favor in adding to their store of knowledge that added piece of awareness of their terrible lack of knowledge. It also happens that young men of the richer classes would follow Socrates around. They like to hear the pretenders examined, and they often imitate me and examine others themselves. So how is Socrates a corrupter of the youth? Well, apparently, those young men who witness him taking down the great pretenders and supposed intellectuals then take Socrates' logic and imitate it, and they themselves knock the pretentious big shots down, armed with this new kind of wisdom. That is the corruption here. Socrates is turning the youth of Athens into disrespectful hooligans, and those little brats are turning the most respected men of Athens into a laughingstock. Those young men soon enough discover those who think that they know something but really know little or nothing. And then those who are examined by them, instead of being angry with themselves, are angry with me. This confounded Socrates, they say, this villainous misleader of youth. This is the real issue. But can these great respected men explicitly complain that they have been made to look like idiots in the public square? Of course not. Socrates continues. In order that they may not appear to be at a loss, they repeat the ready-made charges which are used against all philosophers, about teaching things up in the clouds and under the earth and having no gods, for they do not like to confess that their pretense of knowledge has been detected. And so Socrates turns to Melatus, who has charged that Socrates is a doer of evil and corrupter of the youth, and does not believe in the gods of the state, and has other new divinities of his own. In response, Socrates insists that he will examine those counts in detail, and in doing so demonstrate that Melatus is a doer of evil, and the evil is that he makes a joke of a serious matter, and is too ready at bringing other men to trial from a pretended zeal and interest about matters in which he never had the smallest interest. So, Socrates picks apart Melatus' argument one piece at a time. For instance, if he himself is the supposed corrupter of the youth, then who is their improver? Melatus struggles to actually name just who might be the improver of youth, and Socrates responds, is not this rather disgraceful and a very considerable proof of what I was saying, that you have no interest in the matter? After much hemming and hawing, Melatus insists that the laws improve the youth, as do the judges, the audience, the senators, the citizens, everybody but Socrates. Socrates brings out his horse metaphor. He loves the horse metaphor. Is this the case with horses? Is it not rather the case that there is only one man who improves horses, the horse trainer, whereas everyone else more or less does them harm? What a coincidence that Socrates just happens to be the one man who does them harm. I am very unfortunate if that is true. Socrates turns to the accusation of whether or not he believes in the gods of the state and has other new divinities of his own. He never really addresses this head on, and we may be left to suspect that no, he doesn't, or that he doesn't claim any sufficient knowledge of the nature of the gods. I would suspect that calling them gods of the state in the first place may be a wrinkle that is driving Socrates from making a direct acknowledgement of holding some firm belief. He may have been ahead of his time in anticipating the need for separating church and state. But instead, he questions Melatus about these supposed new divinities that he believes in. Is Melatus saying that Socrates believes in some gods and not others? Or is Melatus insisting that Socrates is a flat-out atheist? Melatus sees an advantage to this argument and jumps in. Yes, I am saying that Socrates is a full-on atheist, swearing by Zeus that Socrates believes in absolutely no gods at all. And Socrates responds by picking apart a riddle. Is it possible to believe in human things and not in human beings? Can one believe in horsemanship and not in horses? Can one believe in flute playing and not in flute players? Of course not. But then can a man believe in spiritual and divine agencies and not in spirits or demigods? Demigods are a sort of half-man, half-god created by the mating between gods and nymphs, or humans. This was back in the day when people assumed that God might well find himself every bit as attracted to a human woman as he would his goddess companion, which, if you ask me, sounds like projection. But if Socrates accepts the existence of such demigods, as apparently he does, and as was indicated in Melatus' actual indictment, then he must of necessity believe in the existence of those original gods. Or, as he says, you might as well affirm the existence of mules and deny that of horses and asses. He likes his horse metaphors. Now, whether Socrates believes in the gods or not seems almost entirely irrelevant to the issue that Socrates keeps coming back to chip away at, which is to say that Melatus is insincere in his argument to begin with. Each time Socrates runs a ring around him logically, he demonstrates that Melatus hasn't really given it any thought and has advanced a capricious, insincere argument simply for the sake of getting rid of Socrates. We may also assume that many of the other judges are choosing to overlook the insincerity of the argument because they've been embarrassed or are afraid of being embarrassed too. And so, the fix is in. Socrates knows that these are bad faith arguments to begin with, and calling out the bad faith foundation of the argument is much more important than allowing himself to be dragged into it. He attacks the judges, mostly Melatus. You, Melatus, have sufficiently shown that you never had a thought about the young. Your carelessness is seen in your not caring about matters spoken of in this very indictment. Socrates dispenses of Melatus' argument in short order by getting him to admit that people are indeed harmed by the increase of corruption in their neighbors, which means that Socrates, quite aware of the damage that such corruption would do to him as well as the community, would either make conscious efforts to avoid corrupting the youth, or that such corruption would have been unintentional, and acts that are unintentional are not crimes. Socrates drives this home. You ought to have taken me privately and warned and admonished me, for if I had been better advised, I should have left off doing what I only did unintentionally. But you indicted me in this court, which is a place not of instruction, but of punishment. Melatus has no care at all, great or small, about the matter. You are a liar, Melatus, not believed even by yourself, for I cannot help thinking, O men of Athens, that Melatus is reckless and impudent, and that he has written this indictment in a spirit of mere wantonness and youthful bravado. He said to himself, I shall see whether this wise Socrates will discover my ingenious contradiction. For he as much as said that Socrates is guilty of not believing in the gods, and yet of believing in them. Such nonsense, Melatus, could only have been intended by you as a trial of me. You have put this into the indictment because you had nothing real of which to accuse me. So there it is. Socrates has exposed the false logic and the true motives of his accuser, Melatus. Will it make any difference? Well, that's my take on the second part of Socrates' apology. I'm releasing a parallel set of videos alongside these explainers with an uncut reading of these sections of the speech. I haven't memorized it, but I think it's easier to understand when you can hear the words inflected with what I imagine might have been Socrates' tone of voice. You can watch that series from the very first section here, and this section, the one I covered today, here. Please come join me for this week's performance of The Greatest Speech of All Time, Sunday, February 14th on Facebook and Monday, February 15th, 2021 at 8 p.m. Central Time on Zoom. It's available for discounted school and group bookings the rest of that week. If you're watching this video after that, please check our current schedule at timmooneyRep.com. And if this video has helped your understanding in any way, please take that fraction of a second to tag that like button or subscribe or share this with your friends. And please drop by my website at timmooneyRep.com to find out about all the other shows we've got coming up in future weeks. Our goal is to inspire, inform, enlighten, educate, and entertain. If you're interested in helping us with that, we've got a donate button at timmooneyRep.com and a Patreon site with fun merch available to patrons at patreon.com/timmooneyRep. See you on the stage.